Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another fascinating guest today, involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Savva Kerdemelidis, who is the founder and chief executive officer of an organization called Crowdfunded Cures, which is focused on developing this mission to incentivize clinical trials for off-patented therapies that are normally ignored because the monopoly price ultimately can't be enforced with patents, so no incentive to develop by biotech companies or big pharma. Savva is a commercial and intellectual property consultant, legal counsel, and a patent attorney. He has 2 decades of experience advising in relation to intellectual properties, commercial law, as well as crypto. He graduated with both a Bachelor's of Science and an LLM from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. He's admitted as a barrister and a solicitor in the High Court of New Zealand and a lawyer in the Supreme Court of Queensland in Australia. He is also a New Zealand and Australian patent and trademark attorney. And very interestingly, in 2014, Savva conducted his thesis on this theme of alternatives to the patent system, specifically focused on the development of medicines. He founded Crowdfunded Cures as a New Zealand charity back in 2013 to ultimately implement this idea of using a rather unique pay-for-success contract model as an incentive to find new uses for these off-patented drugs and other so-called un-monopolizable therapies. We're honored to have him with us today. Lots of interesting topics to get into. But Savva Kerdemelidis, welcome to our show. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much. Great. And thanks for the awesome introduction.
Savva, I would love to start off by hearing the background story to all this and a little bit, not just about you, but take us up until the point in 2014 where you published Deadly Gaps in the Patent System, an analysis of current and alternative mechanisms for incentivizing development of medical therapies. And for everyone listening, you can find this amazing document. It's very long, but it's out there on the internet and really is a nice synopsis of what this story is all about. But Savva, take us into sort of that early background journey that led up to this.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it really did come around from at the time I had an opportunity to go back to uni, and my partner at the time had got really sick with Crohn's, and as you do when that happens, you go online and kind of look around and see what treatment options there are, and the main one obviously Humira, massive blockbuster drug. But there were other evidence around, dietary interventions, particularly enteric nutrition, things like off-patent drugs like low-dose naltrexone, other dietary interventions and supplements. The problem is that those treatments, they got a lot of evidence that, sort of a lot of hype really online as to the efficacy. But when you try to dig behind it and look at what the evidence was, it typically was a very small evidence base, like a very small clinical trial. Obviously, these kinds of therapies tend to be publicly funded, and often those funding agencies do not want to fund large clinical trials. And then sort of from my commercial and IP background, I understood that essentially it was because of this failure to enforce a monopoly price. There wasn't really a business model around this. And then I did do biology post-grad, although I didn't really have an opportunity to do a lot of that work and my legal work, mainly work for tech companies. But it was really frustrating to me, I think, and would be frustrating to, say, scientists, that essentially medicine, or the practice of medicine, at least the commercialization of medicine, is being guided by these arbitrary patent incentives, and which are essentially just another kind of contract. But for whatever reason, we don't actually value the clinical trial data where we can't enforce a monopoly price. And this kind of led me down into doing the thesis and saying, well, like this, even if you were to, I was considering doing a PhD and looking at, how it could help with Crohn's and things like that. But then I thought, well, it's actually more important, I think, to try and figure out how you sort of can address this commercial disincentive. Because I mean, IP is an amazing tool. It's created a lot of the amazing things that surround us today. We probably wouldn't, arguably wouldn't exist without kind of the hand of visible hand of Adam Smith and the commerce and being able to basically privatize and monetize your efforts through this sort of private property idea. But the idea that the fact that you can't create a business model around these kinds of I called un-monopolizable therapies I thought was a significant problem and a missed and a gap in our current incentive system. So that's what kind of led me down this area, and I did spend a couple of years on the thesis. It's quite a big one, kind of around sort of 80,000 words plus 200,000 if you include footnotes and things. So definitely don't feel like you have to have a look, but it would be amazing if it increased the readership to a few more if somebody's got I am basically set up crowdfunded cures as a charity to essentially implement the ideas in the thesis. And the core idea was that in the patent system, there's always been this kind of argument that other prize-like incentives might be a better kind of alternative to patents, because essentially with prizes, you don't have to have this monopoly price and these what they call deadweight losses and things, and negative externalities as a result of basically charging things at a monopoly price. And with a prize, you can basically open source and have the benefit of of whatever the innovation is immediately accessible, but you don't but you still have a commercial or basically a traditional commercial model around, or a market model around generating that data. However, it hadn't really been looked at in the context of these particular kinds of therapies. Like Bernie Sanders talked about replacing all of pharmaceutical patents with a big $80 billion prize. I thought that wasn't really practical, but you could definitely do a much smaller targeted kind of prize-like incentive, which really focused on what I called these unmonopolizable therapies. So things like repurposing off-patent drugs, diet supplements, lifestyle interventions, plant medicines, all these kinds of things which could be very medically effective, but because we can't essentially incentivize the getting return on investment for funding the clinical trials, they was sort of very underfunded, and you tended not to see these things affect clinical practice. So that's a bit of background.
Excellent. And let's just talk about the sort of the scope of this sort of pharmacotherapeutic wasteland per se, because I think we need to put that all in perspective for the audience that may be less aware that we have a tremendous amount of generic medicines out there that have been around for decades, that have only been developed for maybe one indication, two indications. So there's a tremendous dimension there that can be we can dive into it. These drugs have been tested in clinical trials, and all the safety work is done. So the traditional billions of dollars to develop them for indication X as opposed to indication Y is much less. So you have that universe. And then you have, as you were just mentioning, when you got into lifestyle and diet and so forth, you have all this other stuff, like the nutraceuticals and the botanicals that, they may not, they have their own unique situation, and we'll get into when we get to commercialization later on. There's some interesting things we can chat about, but here you have products that, they had no patent at all, maybe their nature or whatever, but they're very unique in their composition. And I love to point out the story that one of the most prescribed drugs of all times has never had competition. It's been off patent since the 1940s, and that's Pfizer's Premarin, which is a nondescript mixture of horse urine estrogens. No patent at all, but they have nice little monopoly. So there are kind of unique little buckets as well that you can throw into what you're doing here. Talk about sort of the landscape in general, about how you look at it in terms of, what are important targets in the short term, traditional generic drugs versus, I know one of the things you presented on in the past was you talked about BCG vaccine and sort of repurposing it for stuff like diabetes. And here you have a 120-year-old product that most of the monopoly is actually in how you manufacture it as opposed to everything else. But talk a little bit about the landscape so the audience can get a picture, a broader picture on all this.
Yeah, it's so it is huge. There's this massive blue ocean. There's something like 7,500 generic drugs that are off patent. Studies have shown that once a drug goes generic, essentially there's its chance of getting regulatory approval for a new use is almost zero. You might get some, there's some very specific examples of where it can happen, like it's particularly recent history with dexamethasone, and that was a sort of chance discovery that could help reduce risk of death for people that are intubated. Obviously the ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, we won't go there, but there are a bunch of these drugs, but unfortunately they're not really looked at unless you can reformulate them. And then oftentimes, actually, the original formulation might be better, or this might be the case with ketamine versus S-ketamine. Ketamine is a racemic mixture. It's been shown to be actually used off-label. It can actually have better efficacy for treatment-resistant depression and other indications, particularly. But S-ketamine is the intranasal version that they basically created in order to wrap a monopoly and be able to enforce a monopoly around it and have a new molecule. But it's less bioavailable, and there's evidence to show that it's potentially not as effective. So then as you talk about, there's like 50,000 or so nutraceuticals, if not more, plant medicines. So there's this massive universe of molecules that are already out there. And the other point is that they're typically been used in people like for many years, particularly generics, and nutraceuticals are designated as generally recognized as safe compounds. Obviously a lot of them are not, but these things have a lot of safety advantages that, say, a brand new novel molecule might not have, that hasn't been used in humans. So there's this kind of untapped resource, and also this focus on the sort of practice of medicine to essentially, with the pharma industry, just focus on what can we patent and monopolize, and how can we kind of basically game the patent system or use other kinds of tricks, like to try and restrict the supply or have some sort of way of enforcing a monopoly, but that might not be available for all sorts of medical interventions. And the other point is around, if you've got the monopoly, you're incentivized to do is sell as much of this drug as you possibly can. So things like personalized medicine before the patent runs out. So things like personalized medicine really kind of take a bit of a back foot. Essentially, you've got other incentives potentially like more controversial, like wanting to treat symptoms and not looking at curative interventions and things like, for example, like antibiotics and things like that have a very limited incentive under the patent system, typically because they're like used third in line, and they're not very high volume products. And so this is where we've seen a little bit of reform actually with these Netflix subscription models, where just a fixed amount is paid every year. It's a little bit like a prize model, where they basically just say what it's worth. So but a lot of examples. I guess the ones that we're most interested in, I think, ketamine versus S-ketamine. I think that's a bit of a no-brainer to take, but unfortunately no business model at the moment under the patent system because ketamine is like $2 a dose. Very interested in things like ketogenic diets, shown a lot of promise for a lot of different diseases, particularly type 2 diabetes, but also, things like cancer. Cancer cells require 10 times as much sugar as normal cells, as acidic glycolysis,
Right.
Warburg effect, and ketogenic diet has shown efficacy in certain kinds of cancer, particularly glioblastoma. Obviously, these are very small, tiny trials, but what if this was better than, glioblastoma, you've got 95 to 99% chance of dying. It's just your treatment options are just dismal. But nobody, what if ketogenic diet could be a game changer for a lot of people? But there's this kind of disconnect between the potential for this therapy and the fact that, well, we don't see it as medicine, or it's not seen as credible just because you can't wrap a business model around funding the clinical trials.
Okay, so now we've laid the groundwork and explained to the audience that there's a potential ocean of pharmacotherapeutic interventions here that's, orders of magnitude larger than the sort of the current pharmaceutical industry's payload, or what they deal with. Let's now dive into crowdfunded cures and a bit of the model you've created there. I sort of initially started from your thesis. You've created a concept around a pay-for-success contract or a social impact bond that ultimately will bring other investors in to help fund these types of trials in return for certain payments based on how much quality of life, adjusted years, and so forth. Savva, take your time with this part, because I think this is extremely important. You have screen sharing ability there if you want to go to some slides, but let's walk through the crowdfunded curative model and what exactly you're thinking this is going to look like.
Yeah, so it's changed. We're evolving, but ultimately the core idea of it is that you can use contracts in a way to create a business model around something that might not have a business model, and particularly around the delivery and the funding of data and successful clinical trials. Because essentially, when a drug company is doing its R&D, it's not actually the molecule that's the important thing. It's the clinical trial data showing that the molecule is safe and effective.
Yep.
And the mechanism to make your money back is just selling that molecule at a very high price and trying to restrict access to the molecule, when there are other business models around potentially having, say, a payer like a health insurer or a government, say CMS, VA, etc., NHS, or your large health insurers, agree that to purchase essentially your branded version of this treatment protocol, whatever it might be, subject to, say, FDA approval, and then agreeing in advance that they will pay a premium for that, and they'll basically agree to, say, purchase it for X number of years. And that agreement is something called an advance market commitment. And that would enable you then, or whoever it might be, to basically go off and do the clinical trials. There's no risk taken on by the payer. Basically, from their perspective, actually, what they can do is they can ensure that the advance market commitment is a lot, whatever they've committed is a lot less than their potential cost savings overall, or quality impact, what they call a quality adjusted life year. Typically, this is how medicines are paid for, or particularly outside of the US and the NHS, they'll look at a medicine and say, okay, we're willing to pay $50,000 per year of healthy life, assuming 100% healthy life. We're willing to pay $50,000 for that. And the reason why they do that is not because they're trying to be arbitrary, but they're saying that, look, we've got a limited budget, and assuming everyone's life is equal, although there's some weightings given obviously to more vulnerable people and older people, younger people get a much higher cost per quality. And I think for cancer drugs, it ends up being sort of $150,000 per quality, just because of social norms around treating people with cancer. But it ends up that they can basically come up with a price that they're willing to pay. But this hasn't been done before. Like I mentioned, it has been done for antibiotics just recently. In the UK, they did this thing called a Netflix type subscription, where they basically said, okay, if you develop these antibiotics, because the value of the antibiotics is not going to be through the sales of these, through the individual sales of them, but having access to them, we'll agree to pay you, say, $250 million rather, over, say, 10 years, to have access to these antibiotics. So in the same way, I think, you could say, come up with a similar model where you essentially have somebody propose a treatment protocol, and then the government can then sort of negotiate and say, look, if you fund the clinical trials and you get this outcome and we get regulatory approval, then we will pay for that. There is a downside to this model whereby obviously you don't really know in advance what the treatment's going to do. Often, right, it's quite difficult to tell in advance how this treatment is actually going to work. Also, governments, health insurers, they don't like to kind of budget for things 3 or 4 years in advance. Obviously a lot of drug development, it can take 10, 15 years, but the advantage with drug repurposing and nutraceuticals and lifestyle interventions, things, you don't necessarily have to take 10, 15 years, because particularly if things are already relatively safe, you can sort of start phase 2 clinical trials straight away. But even then, you've got to kind of look at predicting, what budgets for the future, and basically having a contractual commitment that might stretch, say, 3 or 4 years into the future. So that's and so I can show the diagram, basically just sort of show how that works, just briefly on that. So that's the pay for success model, and essentially, as I was saying, the thing that you want first is to go to a success payer and you say to them, hey, I've got a repurposed generic, say, looking at ketamine, let's say, for treatment-resistant depression, and you would negotiate to say, hey, if we got this through FDA approval, how much would you pay for this? And let's say the payer is at the moment paying a lot more money for another drug, which might be less effective, say S-ketamine, or similar efficacy, let's say, but they're paying $500 million a year for that, or $100 million a year. Then it would make sense for them, and they've projected that they're going to be paying that into the future. It would make sense for them to make a contractual commitment to say, if you can show that these drugs are equivalent or this other one is better, then we will pay you a smaller amount for your version of the generic, and this would allow a competitive process to have happen. So that would be called a pay for success contract. And the success payer would be say whoever the health insurer was, or CMS or VA or NHS, whoever that might be. And then once you've got that contract, on the back of that contract, then you can raise investment to do the clinical trials. The investors are happy to take on that risk. I mean, that's normal for them. They would crunch the numbers, figure out, okay, if we can make 100 million out of this. And you would also negotiate with multiple payers at sort of in advance. That would add potentially to the transactional complexity, but I don't think it would be impossible, particularly and with a lot of large generic drugs. Actually, you wouldn't necessarily need to get these commitments with that many payers. You could just get some big enough with enough payers that eventually you would get impact investors saying, okay, well, I'm willing to put the money up, whatever that might be, $50 million or whatever, to go through FDA approval. And then those impact investors would then basically go fund the researchers or the biotech company to go through the clinical trials. And if it doesn't succeed, they would lose their investment, and that's basically just a normal biotech company. If it does work out, then they basically they get an FDA approved repurposed generic. They've actually got the on-label version of that generic, so and then they've got some guaranteed sales with that payer. They would then actually be able to sell it to other payers. The other payers could substitute a low-cost generic, perhaps, but you could use method of use patents and potentially a reformulation if you really wanted to try and. There's other business models around that, but the idea is that though you've probably pretty much made because your costs are a lot lower for repurposing, generic drug repurposing. There's a lot lower hump to kind of get over that activation energy to get through to market. And then also you could, as long as you price at a relatively reasonable level, other payers would be willing to also negotiate similar supply agreements. But there is that kind of activation energy problem. And the other point, and I think this is where another model that I'm very interested in, and where I think it's basically the pay for success model, but it's done in a very, very tight way. But it's where you have a low cost drug and you compare it to a very expensive drug, and because of those, the cost difference between the low cost drug and expensive drug. Let's just use ketamine versus esketamine as an example. So ketamine is like very, very cheap, $2 a dose. Esketamine is around $850 a dose. It's around $25,000 to $50,000 plus a year. But let's just say, for instance, it's $25,000 a year. Just by doing a clinical trial, assuming that, say, CMS or VA, whoever they might be, are paying $25,000 a year at least for esketamine, then that means for 1,000 patients, they're paying $25 million for those to service that patient population. Now, if you were to do a clinical trial and you would randomize that patient population of 1,000 people, put half of them on ketamine, half of them on esketamine, then that every patient you put on ketamine instead of esketamine is like a $25,000 saving. And that 500, those 500 people times $25,000 is $12.5 million cost saving, and for vis-a-vis the payer. And then what the payer can do is agree under a contract to say, we will transfer some of those cost savings to actually run the clinical trial itself. So essentially, it's a self-funding clinical trial. It's called interventional pharmacoeconomics. And the beauty of the system is that even if the clinical trial fails, you've still locked in those cost savings. So there's no need for the payer to budget 4 years ahead and have a contingency. Just by putting half of their patient population on low cost ketamine, they've already locked in those savings. Of course, there's an ethical dilemma. You have to be pretty certain and that this treatment is going to be just as effective, if not more effective than the expensive treatment. But to solve that problem, you can do a much smaller trials, and you can basically play around with dosing or come up with other interventions that might be better, not just ketamine, other treatments. But as long as they're very low cost and they can substitute the very high cost treatment, you can basically substitute any low cost treatment for the expensive treatment. And the more expensive the treatment is, the more leverage you have, and essentially you could just iterate and continue to iterate until you come up with a treatment protocol that's effective, as long as it's low cost, and then scale, and then basically have these clinical trials that are essentially self-funding and paid out of cost savings. So this is a kind of the contractual way of basically building a business model for funding these otherwise un-monopolizable therapies. Even things like a diet. If you were to look at a diet and compare it against sort of late stage expensive standard of care using sort of the latest chemo drugs, you can come up with the same business model where they essentially run these trials, essentially paying for themselves. The tricky part is getting the different parties to agree and agree to pay cost savings out of the money saved to fund the clinical trials. Another area where interventional pharmacoeconomics has been used, not so much for generic drug repurposing, what we're talking about. It's been used where you have an expensive cancer drug and you compare the full dose of the cancer drug to a much lower dose of the cancer drug. And typically, like a lot of cancer drugs, particularly ones checkpoint inhibitors or ones that kind of they're very targeted, you don't actually need a very high dose of that drug, and you could maybe dose it at 10%, and then you could stockpile those drugs for future years. And of course, pharma companies, I think, would probably react to that model quite quickly. They would probably try and price their drugs at a certain way according to weight, or have contractual limitations on how those drugs can be stockpiled. I don't think that they could do that realistically very easily. I mean, a big example is this for macular degeneration. There was a drug called Lucentis, and it was basically a reformulated version of this other drug called Avastin, which was an anti-cancer drug, but it was an anti-angiogenesis drug. But it was estimated to basically that one Avastin injection was like $25 compared to $800 or something for Lucentis. And the ophthalmologists figured out that they could just get the Avastin, and there's nothing really that other drug company could have done to stop them from doing that. And that was estimated to save around $10 billion for CMS or Medicaid. So you can really save a lot of money using this model. And then the idea is that you can use those cost savings to then fund a lot of research that probably pharma wouldn't be incentivized to do under the blockbuster drug model.
Really, really interesting model. No, I enjoyed that very much, and see the potential in many areas for what you're proposing here. You mentioned, the esketamine example, Savva, and I would just, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that specifically, because, and I don't know, sort of in New Zealand and in your area of the world, but up here, I mean, psychedelics in general are going crazy as a sort of this evolving segment. And, I profiled a variety of groups on the show, everyone from, the Atai Pharma of the world, which are, re-pharmaceuticalizing them, to folks that are using the generics. Like I had John Wang, one from Johns Hopkins. It's just using, dextromethorphan cough syrup for drug-resistant depression. Dennis McKenna, who, he has his own beliefs. We should all be smoking ayahuasca down in Peru. So, a variety of opinions. Nonetheless, psychedelics have, come to the fore as pharmacotherapeutic interventions with very unique kinetics, pharmacologies, and so forth that are just unexplored. And it seems like that's a perfect path per crowdfunding cures. Talk a little bit about, if you could say more about the esketamine, because I know there's a specific project that you got, but take us a little more into sort of the psychedelic component of this.
Yeah, no, I think, and also I think longevity as well. We can talk about that, but psychedelics,
that's longevity. My next question.
Yeah. I think, I mean, there is obviously a little bit of a hype train at the moment with psychedelics. However, there is some very promising data. And the other issue, I think, which makes this more interesting is that there is a lot of pushback on the idea of kind of monopolizing psychedelics. These are, particularly a lot of the psychedelics, maybe plant medicines, and particularly psilocybin, right, where the, and there might be reasons why the actual plant version, we might have even co-evolved with it. So it might actually be a lot healthier and a better drug versus, say, the crystallized version of it. I think, as an example, maybe not the best one, but I understand that aspirin, the original, came from like a willow bark, and but the willow bark version it doesn't have the same ulcer risk. Now, I might not be right about.
No, you're right. It has all sorts of weird glycosylation patterns. I was involved in that business 20 years ago, but we'll talk about that offline.
Okay, sure. But that sort of thing, and I think, and particularly the idea that, and I think that's what a lot of psychedelics companies are going to run into, is that when they try and monopolize something, they're just going to, it's a bit of a short-lived thing, because people are going to start doing these head-to-head studies where they figure out, okay, these drugs, actually are effective in this particular, and it's not so much the molecule, it's really more about everything else and the therapy and the setting. And these are the things that we should be pursuing, instead of just trying to follow the patent system and having the patent system dictate what gets in patients and what treatments get to patients, instead of actually what's the best thing for patients and what's the healthiest, what's actually better treatment. Right. But yeah, I think it's almost all the psychedelics have this issue where the ingredients are off patent. LSD, MDMA. You've got MAPS, which basically have this anti-patent strategy, which they're taking to market, and that's great. But the reason they can sort of get away with it is because they would have the only, say, FDA-approved version of MDMA. But then as soon as MDMA becomes potentially legalized, and available from multiple sources, then that's going to, basically not really be a long-term model. But then on the other hand, MAPS, I think, they're not really so concerned with that side of things versus maybe another more traditional pharma.
Right.
But I think, again, with Compass Pathways, what they're doing with psilocybin and their polymorph A, sort of crystalline version of psilocybin, I think they will just run up against the fact that people will be able to access the truffles for relatively low cost and be I'm sure there'll be a lot of clinics using it therapeutically. And so, but you've got this issue then, this market failure, and the same thing we're seeing with ketamine is that you've got a lot of people, a lot of clinics using it off label, and there's this kind of perception that sort of it's a bit of a wild west out there, which I think doesn't help patients and doctors. And then on the other side, you've got, doctors prescribing esketamine, but then a lot of the patients potentially esketamine maybe is not as good, or it might be very good, but then it's extremely expensive. And so you've got this problem with people not necessarily sort of stuck between doing it in an off-label clinic and potentially where they're what's happening at the moment is their health insurers will not reimburse ketamine off-label, so they actually have to pay it out of pocket. And ironically, even though it's a lot cheaper, because of the cost of the clinics and everything else, they're having to. It's actually really expensive for them, and you've got people that are suicidal and dying. Because they don't have access to very safe, effective, low-cost medicine. So very real problems, I think, and due to this market failure. And I think, something where I think a forward-thinking payer could actually solve the problem just by doing this head-to-head study, comparative clinical trial where they've got a massive esketamine budget. Then, they could actually just self-fund it through get ketamine FDA approved just through this scalable model. And then there's other ways essentially to use these advanced market commitments, as I was talking about, to basically solve that last mile problem and get a pharma company to actually optimize the protocol for the low cost intervention. Then more importantly, if something actually goes wrong and ketamine ends up not being the best drug, they've got recall insurance, product liability insurance, they've got someone to sue. I think that's a very important thing that is missing from the current model, which is where you've got grant funding. If you pay for a grant and then some doctor goes and prescribes things off label, there's no real incentive to keep, if something goes wrong, like are you going to sue the government or the researcher that published the original clinical trial? It's not very scalable, that model. So yeah.
Let's hop over to longevity because and just a little background for folks who've been watching the show. I've done some repurposing episodes on very specific niche orphan indications, and rapamycin pops up all the time. We do on the show we did with Castleman's disease. We did a show on Proteus syndrome, and rapamycin has this awesome potential to not just for organ transplantation, but really to modulate the immune system. And then we've had folks on from Matt Caberline to Brad Stansfield looking at rapamycin, not just for specific disease indications, but broader in terms of health span. I neglected to mention at the beginning of the show that in addition to all your activities at Crowdfunded Cures, you were also a legal advisor to this organization, Vita DAO, which is getting a lot of press lately over here. Take us into a little bit of what you think about in general when you think about longevity and sort of these broader indications for repurposing, and a little bit of what I don't know how much you talk for Vita DAO, but if you can mention a little bit about that model and how it sort of synergizes with what you guys are up to.
Sure. I mean, yeah, Vita DAO is the sort of the crypto side of things, and it's obviously its own little rabbit hole. But I think, personally think that's a super exciting project. I think that's, crypto's has had a lot of flack, but this the idea of decentralized science, I think is almost like going to be the most important use case for crypto, and also deep down what crypto are trying to do, and at least a lot of the movements, so the more positive movements like what they call regenerative finance and DeSci, is about fixing a lot of the misaligned incentives under the current system with capitalism, and that includes addressing these kinds of market failures through essentially what they call smart contracts, but essentially the same as like real contracts, but and essentially creating a way of incentivizing people to do what's best for everybody, and create what they call public goods rather than creating extractive models where only certain few people benefit and to the expense of many. But in the longevity field, and this is what VitaDAO I think is, they're also working on this particular field, which I think is the probably, it's got a lot in common with crypto actually, and a lot of overlap between crypto, psychedelics, longevity is, so there's a bit of overlap, at least culturally. But the thing with longevity is that it's such an important and relatively neglected area, at least until recently, though, of health, and one that could have a massive health impact. So, often quoted is that, if you cure cancer tomorrow, you might increase lifespan by four years or so. But if you can come up with a longevity intervention that increases healthy lifespan by say 10 years, then you basically you can add billions and trillions of dollars to kind of to GDP and value, and sort of having people and obviously keeping them out of hospital and healthier longer. That's also got a lot of economic benefits. But with regards to this particular model, and why I think what we're talking about with these unmonopolizable therapies, or therapies where the traditional patent model might not work, most of the drugs that we know, or we've got the most evidence for, that might improve healthy lifespan, so things like rapamycin, metformin, NMN, NAD, vitamin D, all these other things, calorie restriction, resveratrol, they're all off patent. And so, there's very limited incentives to do this research. And you've got sort of a lot of projects stuck in limbo. I know with Brad Stanfield, he's looking at doing a rapamycin study combined with exercise. So sort of a lifestyle intervention plus rapamycin, and this very clever way of dosing one on the weekend, and then you do exercise during the week. So it sort of balances out mTOR. And so a lot of thought, a lot of innovation around how this, potentially might work and improve strength in the elderly, which is correlated very highly with healthy longevity. But unfortunately, he's got to go around, trying to raise money on YouTube, he is working with VitaDAO. They did get him a bit of a grant. We are actually working with VitaDAO and another organization, Protocol Labs, in this HyperCerts framework, where we're looking at doing what's called a longevity prize, where we try and raise like a retroactive fund, which is a little bit like this advanced market commitment I was talking about, where essentially you create a prepayment, agreeing to prepay for clinical trial data, successful clinical trial data. But I think it is an area. It's obviously a little bit more difficult to go to health insurers or get governments on board, just because I think there's a lot of controversy still, unfortunately, around the idea of longevity and improving longevity, and whether aging is a disease and whether it's recognized as a disease. So there's sort of political barriers even on top of what we're facing. So for that reason, I think crypto might be an area where they can sort of jump the gun a bit. And at least in the past, there was a lot of people that were interested in longevity, also quite wealthy, that might be interested in these different models outside the traditional grant model, where they have to take on all the risk of which projects to fund, with this kind of pay for success model we call impact markets. Essentially, they can just create like a prize fund that pays out for successful clinical trials. So we're hoping to be able to push things forward. Obviously, though, it's very hard to do fundraising and things and explain how things working. But I think Needle's ticking along, and VitaDAO definitely a great project. Amazing community of scientists, and they just raised 4.1 million, I think, and but there's around 5,000 in the community, and just great to be involved there. Just more on the legal side, and I can go in on this IP NFT model as well, what they're doing with Molecule. Also raised around 12 million or 18 million now, I think. So kind of, it's kind of a healthy, particularly. There's also Pfizer apparently invested in VitaDAO as well. So there's a bit of sort of legitimacy on the basis of that's apparently their first longevity investment. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting to watch, and I sometimes have a hard time wrapping my head around distributive science, but it's been interesting seeing them come along and see how that evolves, because definitely these health span trials are going to need some unique thinking about ultimately how this gets done. And I think again, your crowdfunding cures model fits nicely into components of this. So that's it's nice to see. So talk a little bit about, because I know, and I watched some of your previous presentations, and you've mentioned the theme of branded generics as a component of this, potentially, in the sense that you and I could work together on improving the quality of life adjusted years and make money by saving money in the healthcare system. But there is the potential here for novel products to come out. Not every product, of course, if we're dealing with the truly single molecule generic, that there's not really a great way to redo. But in some of these, especially we look at, say, the nutraceuticals, back in the 1990s, the FDA created a segment here in the United States known as the botanical drug, which very few companies went into. I have my own background story there, but that's for another show. But where it is possible nowadays, if you have the interest to take a mixture, a plant mixture, down the drug path, to create a new branded product at the end of the day, that it has to be different than the nutraceutical on the market in the sense of concentration and all that. But so there are some interesting ways to create new products. Talk a little bit about some of your ideas in terms of branded, and a branded generics isn't sort of I would say the repurposed brand, or whatever we want to call it. But take us through some of your ideas in that space, if you would, because I think there's other revenue streams here that are interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something I think a traditional pharma are quite familiar with. But I think what you're talking about, there's an area, it's more of a spectrum of, say, drugs which are like a brand new kind of, say, unique new molecular entities on one side of the spectrum. And then on the other side, which is the area that we're sort of interested in, which is these really, really unmonopolizable things, where essentially you've got an unreformulated generic that's perhaps in its original formulation, and it's available everywhere, and you can't really stop people from accessing it or buying it, or a nutraceutical you can just buy online on the internet for very, very cheap, or a lifestyle intervention or a diet, plant medicine, things like that. And then you've got this kind of like in-between model where like you can look at, say, extracting things and purifying in a way that's in a way that's not the same as the one that's out there in the public. And what we call like reformulations. So basically, where you might combine different nutraceutical with another generic. So, for instance, what the latest ALS drug, I forgot the name, but it's being priced at $160,000 a year. It's actually just this. It's some sort of supplement. Actually, you can buy online and for like $30 a month. And this generic drug, which happens to be, I think it was around $7,000 a month. I think it's just because it's a very kind of, I think it's more that not many people are making this particular generic drug, and this is why. So there's a limited supply of it, and that's why it's quite expensive. But obviously, this company created and they're projecting like $1 billion in sales. So it's going to be a proper blockbuster drug. And it was done through this kind of reformulation model. So there's definitely scope to create reformulations and make money out of them, and there's a lot of examples of that happening. However, it's very selective. Like, you're not going to be able to do it, for example, if this drug, certain areas where, particularly where it's a disease where doctors are going to be more conservative and less willing to prescribe off label. You're going to have maybe less involvement of compounding pharmacies. We don't know what the story is actually going to be with the ALS drug. They might run into issues with compounding pharmacies, who knows? But they've still, these things are all kind of commercial considerations as well as IP considerations. So it does kind of gray and muddy up the area a little bit. But we're very much focused, I think, on the very, very left side, where essentially it is going to be very difficult to basically essentially get a composition of matter patent for like a reformulation and treat it just like it's a monopoly price drug and sell it that way. But you talked about branded generics, and I think it still fits in there. What we're kind of looking at is almost like it is going to be a branded generic. So, for instance, with ketamine, our version of ketamine, it's still going to be the same, $2 version of dose of ketamine. but we could brand it as, say, open ketamine or ketamine for whatever for depression, and we could price it slightly above the low cost. Now, of course, there's a risk it could be substituted out at the pharmacy level and things like that, and that's kind of the reason for the market failure. But when you've got a branded generic, you can actually have a contract, and the idea is that you would, for instance, you could use this interventional pharmacoeconomic model to basically get the data from a payer paid out of cost savings for free. So your costs, you don't necessarily need to make as much revenue back to make return on investment, or there's a kind of partnership arrangement with the payers. And then you also can basically the idea of the way to get around this idea of something which is unmonopolizable with having a business model around it is you have this contractual commitment in advance to say, if we get through FDA approval, we will purchase your brand and we're not going to substitute it with a cheaper brand, or we're just going to guarantee you a little bit like the subscription, the Netflix subscription model we talked about with antibiotics. We're just going to guarantee you minimum sales of, say, $25 million a year just for having this, and then you just supply it to us at whatever price the marginal cost of the supply is. And there's other things you can do to build a moat. Basically, there's this idea of REMS. I think it's basically like whether you have a dangerous control drug, and a bit like ketamine, you can basically have a REMS plan where the FDA requires you to use our branded version in conjunction with therapy, and make sure that's not being abused. Or obviously you can't use that for other types of drugs, but you can leverage method of use patents. And then you can, I think, get into the kind of more traditional reformulation space. But once you start pushing into reformulation, you are getting into the kind of more traditional pharma kind of model, and you have to do maybe safety tests again, and it starts to get a little bit more expensive.
Sure.
But it's definitely a model that has been done, and actually a lot of pharma companies tend to just it's seen as a little bit of a pejorative way of thinking about it, where they just talk about these evergreening, and they just do a new reformulation of like an old drug, and it's not really much better than the old drug, but then they push a lot marketing dollars into it and push it onto doctors and get them to try and switch to the expensive version. So definitely not a new idea.
Yeah, no, I was thinking more from the perspective of sort of some of the combinations that are never tried, that, if you put two generics together, that, may be quite synergistic, and but again, the same issues, and you never know how, what I've seen some interesting patents actually in the past where 1 + 1 = much more than 2, but again, these things are never developed beyond just the idea. So no, it's as I was just bringing up in the sense to sort of complete the landscape, that there are many tributaries that run from this, and I think it's an impressive model that you put together, and a lot of sort of things come off of this that maybe have not been accessible in the past, and this allows you to take a new look at these methodologies and potential for new interventions. So I'm excited for you. As I said, I enjoyed. I didn't read all whatever 1,000 pages of your thesis, but I did enjoy diving into to how you were thinking about this 10 years ago, and to see it come into fruition in this way is exciting. Anything else that's coming up for 2023 that I missed, or that you might want to mention in terms of where you're going to be and the conferences you're going to be presenting at, or places that we can meet you? And anything else, please?
Yeah, sure. So definitely, it's definitely not there yet. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's still definitely very much in the theoretical stage, but we are pushing forward with trying to validate the model and talk to payers and find payers that care. So a big problem in the States particularly is that, a lot of the traditional kind of health insurers, they don't necessarily want to reduce the costs of the US healthcare system from a $4 trillion industry to a $2 trillion industry, because that's $2 trillion worth of salaries and sales that they're throwing out the window. So there are these perverse incentives, and a lot of the times it's the the customer, like the people, basically end up paying the very high premiums, and they're very happy to pay them because they think, well, I just saved $1 million on this drug or this therapy, so I'm happy to keep paying $20,000 a year or whatever it might be. But they don't get to see that there's been a rebate, or there's not a lot of price transparency and things like that. So there's a lot of perverse incentives at the moment, particularly under the US healthcare system. So part of the difficulty is finding who cares, and so we're trying to talk to VA, we're trying to talk to CMS, people like the US Army, and particularly self-insured employers. I mean, you'd think that they want to reduce costs, because if they're covering their employees' healthcare costs and their employees are sick, they also want to keep their employees healthy, because that ultimately improves their profit, their bottom line. So we think that's probably a good area to start with a pilot, and we're trying to engage with folks. But definitely, if anyone out there listening knows people that we can talk to, or I think initially we're going to have to get philanthropy to basically back these studies, do this initial interventional pharmacoeconomic study to sort of show the payers how the model works and how the cost savings would work and things like that. So that's kind of where we're at. We're looking for to engage and find partners. We're sort of partnering with other CROs, basic contract research organizations that do this sort of thing, which are aligned, and just trying to kind of push forward. As far as conferences go, I kind of did that last year. I was evangelizing a bit, sort of went on about 10 podcasts or so, and I still want to raise awareness. I think that's going to be important. Hopefully just the right person kind of hears about this and might want to lend a hand or some funding. But we're also looking to raise funding as well, non-dilutive and dilutive funding. I am planning to be in SF around April, May this year, and then I'll be in Europe likely from June, July, August, September, probably doing some, probably on the crypto circuit, but also be sort of in and out of London. I work remotely out of London, doing a bit of legal consulting on the side while I'm trying to get this underway. But as I was saying, so last year I went to around sort of speaking around 10 conferences as well, mostly crypto and in the DeSci space, but also was at Wonderland conference and there's a psychedelic conference in Miami talking about these paper success models and in the context of psychedelics. But I think not sure exactly which conferences, but probably I missed the I've sort of, it's been good to take a break a little bit in New Zealand, kind of just kind of focus on the market validation side and start talking to potential partners on and focusing on a pilot.
Excellent. Well, I said I'm rooting you on. We will help amplify the message, and it's I wish you the best with it, because it is a sorely needed model, and I'm glad you've brought it this far. So to date, again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Savva Kerdemelidis, founder and CEO of Crowd-Funded Cures. We will put the link in the bio of the show. Also, anyone wants to do a really deep dive, check out his thesis online, Deadly Gaps in the Patent System. Savva, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk for a little while about this fascinating area. Obviously, thank you for championing it. And as we like to say on our show here, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow via what you're doing. It's a really great story. And again, wishing you the best with all of it.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for having me on and helping also spread it and the word, and also just being we had some deep dives, but there's a lot of other things, and happy to talk to anyone that's interested in this topic. Just reach out to me at savva@crowdfundedcures.org.
Awesome. Awesome. Be well.
Cool. Thanks.